G'day viewers, my name is Michael and welcome to Single Racer. And in today's video I'm going to show you my preferred settings that's given me the best results for force feedback in Assetto Corsa. Now I recently upgraded my wheel from my original Logitech Driving Force GT wheel to now the Logitech G29 wheel, because I figured if it's good enough for the sim racing legend Michi Hoyer, then it's definitely good enough for you and I. So one of the things I'm going to do is not only show you my settings, but explain why I have the settings, and I'm going to do it in two parts. The first part involves 3 files that you can do externally in the Assetto Corsa menu to help you get the best settings, and my settings are based around that, but you don't need it. So if you don't want to fuss with files and settings outside of the game, then I'll have a timestamp in the description where you can just click and go straight to my settings, which will still apply to the Logitech G29. And so without further ado, let's do the first part now, which will create a file by using a loot generator or lookup table generator, where you need 3 simple small files. Now luckily all 3 files can be downloaded from Race Department, and the first file you will need is called FFB Clip, or the FFB Clip app, currently version 5.3. And the second file you will need is the loot generator, or LUT lookup table generator for Assetto Corsa, so it's called LUT generator for AC version 0.15. Now if you see here, what you will also need is a little file that it refers to called wheel check, and the link is here, and I'll highlight the link here, and you just click on that and also download that file. And so here are the 3 files here. But an important thing to mention is that I'm, in my personal life, a bit of a control freak, and I like control over all things Windows, and so I have a custom Assetto Corsa folder where I have all my car mods, my track mods and utilities. So the important thing to say here is that these 3 files, even though I've got them in the generic downloads folder from Windows, is you can have them anywhere. They can be run from anywhere. Just a couple of things when you run them will be in certain places, and I'll explain that. But essentially you can save these 3 files to wherever you personally like and run them from wherever you like. So let's move on to the next step. So the first step is simply to install the FFB Clip app, and so unzip it as I've done here and just open up the 2 files. Now if you're already comfortable with installing car and track mods, this should be straightforward, but simply cut and go to your Assetto Corsa directory folder, which is this here, and this is where you'll see both apps and content. So just highlight your main Assetto Corsa folder and simply go paste, and what it'll do, it'll ask you to overwrite the 2 directories, so you just say yes, there's no problem with it, and if it asks you to replace the files, just say yes to that as well, and it'll put it in the correct place. Now after we do that, we want to make sure that the app is ticked within the Assetto Corsa menu, but it's not important to do that right now, so I'll show you that a bit later when I show you my actual wheel settings, and we'll just confirm that the app is actually active. And now the second step is running the little app we downloaded earlier called Wheel Check. Now just to reconfirm again, you can run this from anywhere you prefer to store your downloaded files. It doesn't matter. It really has nothing to do with Assetto Corsa itself, but the one thing you must do is have your wheel connected. Now here is the file here, and just before we run it to show you what it looks like, I said that I would not only show you how to do it but explain why. And so now I want you to imagine that you've walked into your local store. Now in my case in Australia that would be JB Hi-Fi, and you see the G29 box, but you see 10 of them. And the thing is that when they make those wheels, there could be just slight variations in the tightness of the belt or gears, say, you know, just little incremental differences between each product if you had the choice of 10 sitting on the floor or wherever they're held in the store. So when you run this wheel check, what it does here, and now if I can just show you a thing here that I read in the second half, and I must admit that when I ran it the first time, so this is on my Logitech Driving Force GT, I missed this thing, and I just ran the max count, which they stress must not be lower than 50. So I've just always run it at the default 50. But in the description here, the second half of this page on Race Department, it actually says that 100 might be better. So my suggestion, because I've never run it at 100, is why not try 50 and 100? When you run the file, it'll be saved as separate files. So the file will have a date on it, and so you can run it 2 or more times. You could even run it 50, 75 and 100 if you really wanted to push the limits of whether you could notice any difference. But I'm going to later on run it at 100 and see if that makes a difference. So all you do is just double check that that figure is set to 50, but it is by default, so you shouldn't need to worry about it. And you bring down the drop down menu here under Spring Force, and you're looking for one down here called Step Log 2 Linear Force Test. Here it is here. Now I won't run it because I've run it already, but what happens when you do this is, don't be worried, because you'll click it and then it'll seem for a second like nothing is happening with your wheel. But what happens is after say maybe 3 to 5 seconds, the wheel will start to slowly turn left, then turn a bit more left, and then turn a little bit more left, and so on and so on, and we'll go right through the whole rotation, if you like, but only from the left side point of view, and just turn left larger and larger and larger until it hits the final point. And this is what I mean by maybe trying it at 100 as well, is because those moves to the left could be even more detailed, and I must admit I haven't run it myself. So just do that, and that creates a file, and then we move on to the next step. And so by running that second last step, by using the wheel check utility to test the range of your actual wheel, you know, all the steps to get the absolute best force feedback out of the wheel itself, your particular wheel, the one you own, it creates a log file, and it's just knowing where that file is automatically kept, and it's under the same place, but depending on how people use their Windows, you could access it in 2 different ways. So it's under your documents here, and there it is there, the log2 file. So it's a CSV file, and it's automatically stored by that wheel check app. And the other common place that you might do that is under users, Michael in my case, but whatever your username is, and then of course coming to documents, and you'll see the same thing there, which is essentially exactly the same place. Now I've got 2 tips for you here, and that is that when it's created, when you run that wheel check app, it creates the file, but it does it with the date of the exact time that you run the app. Now the good thing about that is if you run it straight after, it doesn't overwrite the file. So this is what I mean by, if we come down to the app itself and then open it up, and I mentioned that they advise that the maximum count here should be no lower than 50, but they recommend running it at 100 because arguably it might give you more detail as the wheel turns and runs through that process. The great thing about that is if we come back to documents, that log2 file won't be overwritten. So you could run it even 3 times, 50, 75 and 100, and all 3 files will be there and be able to be accessed by the next and final step. And then you could see, if you notice on your particular own personal wheel, any difference between say the 50 and the 100. And the final tip here is under documents, where we're going to save that final step. You have your Assetto Corsa folder, and I've mentioned before that I'm a bit of a control freak and I like to save all my settings. So it's a good time to mention that this, under your documents, under your main Windows directory, is where Assetto Corsa keeps all your records, all the replays, records, setups, everything. So if you've never done it before, this might be a good time to know you can grab that folder under documents and back it up if you wish to. It's purely up to you, but you will then have always a backup record of all your high scores and replays and things like that. So now let's move on to that very final step. And just to be clear on that, because I don't want to use the wrong choice of words, so when I say grab your Assetto Corsa directory, I don't mean to move it. I naturally mean to just right click and copy and make a backup copy of all your replays, your save games, your setups, all your high scores, all things, your personal best times, all that, the ghost cars, all that will be saved by coming to the documents folder, right clicking and doing a copy and just putting that copy anywhere you like and making a backup of it. So let's move on now to the final step. And so to wrap up, being an older person, I recognise within myself that I'm a bit of a control freak, but also there's a joke within my family that I'm a bit of a waffler, and that was a deliberate thing where I just wanted to go in a slight bit more detail as to why you need these files and the reason for running them. But it just occurred to me that it'd be a good idea to put in the description, if you ever come back to this video, is I'll now do a recap, because it's essentially 3 simple files and a simple process, or relatively simple. And so let me now do a recap. So you have the 3 files here. You unzip the FFB Clip app, which is a proper app for Assetto Corsa. You unzip it and you install it into the Assetto Corsa main directory, where you installed the game itself. And then you come back to the wheel check utility here, and you run it, and you do the test under where you see the disabled here, the spring force. Drop down the disabled tab here and come down to where it says step log 2 linear force test. When you run this, the wheel will slowly turn left more and more and gain all the data of how much strength is in the wheel that you personally own, and will give you that data in a log file that is now under the documents folder here, the log2 file that it's saved. And the third and final step is now to use this loot generator. And what it is, it's a simple exe file, and this is why it doesn't matter where you save this to, you can run it from anywhere. But it's essentially opening up this little converter, if you like, and what it's going to do is it's going to say, please tell me where that file is now saved, that log file, and I'm going to insert it into the Assetto Corsa folder. So you open it up, you come to the documents here, there's the log2 file, you open it up, And now what it'll do is it'll save it as or convert it maybe in a sense into the loot file, and it's saying to you that it recommends to save it under the Assetto Corsa CFG folder. So it'll open up that documents folder again, but it does it in the users path, meaning your typical Windows users, in my case Michael, but your username, documents, Assetto Corsa. So that's the Assetto Corsa where all your records, your personal records, your save games, your replays is saved, as opposed to the actual proper Assetto Corsa install. And then under the CFG, and then you can choose to give it any name you like. So in the example on Race Department, they used the word, I think it was My Loot, as just an example to save it there. I've saved both my previous Logitech Driving Force GT wheel test and now the new G29 test as Mickey's FFB. But for example, if I run the test at 100%, so the wheel is doing its left thing with maybe a bit more detail, I should give it a second name as long as I do the final step and tell a particular file what name I'm choosing to save it as. So in this case, I could save it as Single Racer FFB. Now imagine I've done that, and then the final step is you close that off and you come to that CFG folder. So remember, it's under Users, Michael, the Documents folder, and that Assetto Corsa folder that saves all your personal records. And there's the CFG. So you open up the CFG, and there is my original Mickey's FFB, but say in this case I've saved it as Single Racer FFB. I then come here to this particular file, which is your ff_post_process.ini file. Now here's an example also where I'm a bit of a control freak, in that if you want to do this and you're worried about what happens to my my original file that has saved all this information, is you could back it up. So you just right click, make a copy somewhere else, and then rename the last part, the ini file after the dot, as backup, or back in my case, you know, anything that will save the original file. And then you can create the file you want to edit by either editing the file, which I've already got it associated with Notepad, or you come down to open with Notepad or WordPad. Notepad is easier, and then you edit the file, and this is the final change. So what you want to do is you want to change the type now equals the loot, which is the loot file, so the extension here of the loot. You change enabled from 0 to 1. So originally by default it's set to 0, so by changing it to 1 you're saying actually enable it or make it active. And then you come down under the loot directory and you simply say where it says curve equals, and curve is the actual wheel test. As it moved the wheel further and further to the left, it's saying now open up that loot file as curve equaled and the name you've chosen to give it. So in this case, in my Logitech Driving Force GT, it was Mickey's FFB. If I run the test at 100% and I save it as Single Racer FFB, I would just simply change that to Single Racer FFB and then save it, and then it will now know, Assetto Corsa will now know to refer to that file as your force feedback settings for Assetto Corsa. And so as we segue or transition, if you like, between how to install those three files to give you the ultimate force feedback and my actual Assetto Corsa force feedback settings in game, I thought it was very important to show the force feedback settings from within the Assetto Corsa menu itself, and that's because us as creators quite often run Content Manager, but we're familiar with it, but beginners who might be buying the G29 as a starter wheel might not be, and I wanted to make sure that I showed the Assetto Corsa menu rather than the Content Manager menu. But just as an example, because those of us that do run Content Manager know how much more detailed it is, if we come to the control settings here, you can actually see a reference to that loot file that ends up being the file that tells Assetto Corsa how to run the force feedback settings, and even the graph that the wheel check ran, and the actual output of what the wheel gave out, the information, the data that it gave out. And make sure that when you reference the ini file, when you edit that ini file, give it the full name, because I was referring to Mickey's FFB, but really it should be the full name, Mickey's FFB Loot Settings. I know that's a convoluted name, but that's the name I gave it. So just make sure it's the full name of whatever you choose to give the file to use as the reference. And so now, let me show you my force feedback settings within the game menu, but more importantly, let me explain why I have these settings, because I feel that's more important. But just before we do, let's come over here to Options General and go down to the very bottom and just confirm that you've installed the FFB Klep app correctly, and if you haven't, it wouldn't be showing up here. But also just make sure it's ticked or active, and that completes that part of the app itself to give you that brilliant force feedback. So let's now go over to the controllers, and there's a couple of things that I want to mention before my settings. And the first one is simply because I don't have the experience, so it's the one and only thing I'm unsure about, and that's because when I had my previous wheel, the Driving Force GT, and all the wheels before it, they never had a clutch. So this is my first experience, and I heard someone talk about the problem they were having, but they could have had very high-end gear, and they were feeling that they were getting clutch slip, or a kind of lack of power because of that clutch slip, and they got around it because they had the clutch set to 100 or 100%, and they found that when they set it down to 50%, that seemed to remove the problem. Now, I just went with 50% based on that, but I don't have the experience to know clutch wise what the best setting is. So that's the only thing I might change in the future as I get more knowledge. And the second thing, which is a deliberate thing this time, is that my previous Driving Force GT had its own software, but the software allowed me to set, which is my preference, a wheel rotation of 240, but this new G29 wheel has different software and actually won't allow me to do that, and seems to work in the opposite way, the similar way that Project Cars 2 and Assetto Corsa Competizione work, where you actually go up over the figure, meaning that instead of me setting, like I originally did, the wheel rotation down here at 240, I now add it to the default of 900 to get my 240 feeling, to get that same feeling of how much I turn the wheel to what I used to have. So if you are wondering why I have 1140 here, that's simply because I add the 240 to the 900, which is its standard wheel rotation, and that gives me that 1140 figure. That's just what I prefer. Most people will run the standard 900 and be totally happy with that, but just so you know. So let's go to the advanced settings, and as you can see now, it's very, very simple. And the first change that I made was simply based on the fact that I saw this graph that had all the readouts, or the Newton meter figures for each individual wheel, and I was kind of surprised to see that the G29 seems to have, if you interpret it that way, less force feedback power than my previous Driving Force GT. The Driving Force GT was listed as 2.5 Newton meters, whereas the G29 is listed as up to 2.5. So it's almost that implication that it doesn't have quite enough. And for me, that came across in how it felt on the track. So my previous setting for the old wheel was 75, and I've upped that to 79. Now the reason that I don't have it at 100, and this is so important, and mind you, if you have it at 100, this is totally up to you. There's a channel called Ferrari Man 601. I can't say that he has it set to 100, but he has his force feedback deliberately set high so it's clipping in game. You've got the little pedal measuring app in game when you're racing, and it shows him clipping, and he constantly gets people commenting, and he's saying that he likes it that way. But the counter argument to that is, let me show you a picture here of a corrugated iron roof, and the argument is that when you feel your force feedback through the wheel, you feel those ups and downs. So as you run over a curb, you feel that curb as a high, like a corrugated iron roof, and then the down as you don't feel anything or feel less. And so my argument is, by having the force feedback deliberately set either down or lighter, my argument becomes that it feels like then, as if you held your hand out, making a fist in front of your face, and then with the other hand, your fingers, you ran your fingers over your knuckles. And the argument is that I feel, or I believe I feel, more detail by having the gain, or the ultimate 100% strength of the force feedback down, and that allows me to feel those knuckle versions. In other words, if we're talking curbs, I'm talking about more like the chatter 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 of each curb as I run over it, as opposed to the corrugated iron feeling, where I just might feel the curb as a general force against the wheel, but I don't feel the individual red white kind of feeling that I should. So, and that's my argument, what I go by. Now there's 4 other settings that I really wanted to discuss. The first one being minimum force, simply because the app that you download, or the little program, there's one program that refers to that and suggests that you should have that set off. I can't remember if Assetto Corsa has it off by default, but it recommends setting that to 0. So the minimum force here set to 0. But the 3 other ones that I want to talk about is because a beginner might believe that if you set this to 0, you're turning it off, but you're not. And if you're not quite sure whether you should believe me or not, the simple way is turn the curbs off, go into a hot lap or a race, and then run over a curb, and you can feel the curb through the wheel. But what most people might not know is these sliders are accentuators, or exaggerate that feeling. So the principle is that if I feel that, I feel the curbs in the wheel, but I wish it was stronger, that's when you would move it up, because you would exaggerate that feeling of feeling the curb. But what I want to do is turn both the curb and the road down, because I want to feel the little knuckle nuances of each just those subtle feelings, and I do feel that through my G29. The one difference is the slip, and that's because of the way I drive. So my technique is called slow in, fast out, and the idea is that if I come into the corner too fast and I start understeering or sliding off the road, what the feeling I want to exaggerate, deliberately exaggerate, is that as I hit the grass, the wheel goes limp, and that tells me through the wheel that I've lost the grip of the bitumen or the road. And the idea being that if I don't crash and I can get the car back, and then as I go from the grass back on the road, suddenly the strength comes back into the wheel, and I go, okay, I'm on the bitumen again, I've got good grip. And so I want to slightly exaggerate that with this setting of 55. Now in the old wheel that was lower at 33, but again because of the less strength maybe I've moved it up to 55. So that's the reason for that effect, while the others are all set to 0. And the final one is the brake gamma, and again this is a very personal thing, but what I've noticed on the G29 is it has so much less play or travel as you push down on the brake compared to my old one, and I think that's because it has some sort of pressure thing behind it to mimic what ABS should feel like. And so the trouble that I've noticed is because my previous setting was 2.40, and what I find is that that's too much now, meaning that I have to push really hard on the brake to, if I ever wanted to deliberately lock up. But by setting the brake gamma all the way back to 0, which means linear, so that becomes one straight line, then I find it's too much, because I'm a slow. My technique is called slowing fast out, and I like to trail brake into the corner. And so I deliberately want less brake pressure, deliberately, from say the starters. I push the pedal down to about 50%. And then from that point, from 50% onwards, is when I do the emergency braking, or I want it to come on a lot stronger. So I don't have it set to 0 so that I don't get initial grab straight away and risk locking the wheels up. But I don't have it as high as I previously had. So I found that, say, 1.69 or 1.70 is a good balance between those two extremes. So I hope all these settings help, and I hope the explanation helps a little bit. But the key thing here is it's just my preference. What I'd advise you to do is, if you're watching this video because you're a total beginner especially, is try and find 3 or 4 other videos that talk about their settings and have a range. So in other words, if the range that you find from 4 people is between say 20% and 50%, use 35 as your mid tier, and or try all 4 settings and just see what's closest to what you like, and then from there do those minute adjustments to do what you prefer. And remember, that channel, Ferrari Man, likes his force feedback, or at least the clipping, deliberately. So don't be scared to have it totally opposite to me. Just take my advice and sort of make up your own mind, and then work it out as you get more experience from not just my video but a whole range of videos, to get an idea of the overall settings and what they do. So I hope that helped you. This is Michael signing out for Single Racer. I'll catch you next time. See you later.